Okay, let's move on to this next story here with Professor Richard Wolff. So I was just telling you about how the U.S. is starting to see a decline, right? These other countries are collaborating together and they're deciding that they're going to do their own thing, which I actually think is really smart because the U.S. is not going to be their buddy. But Professor Richard Wolff, he had a segment recently on Economic Update, and he's talking about the decline of the U.S. empire. And I think everybody needs to hear this. Let's go in.
We're talking about the emergence of a new world economy, a new order in the world economy. And in the first half, we spoke about the end of neoliberal globalization and the turn to economic nationalism. And we also spoke about the end of the stale, old debate between private and state, as if that were the issue, now that we have a world composed of hybrids, of mixtures of state and private that are all capitalist in the sense of that same old relationship between employer and employee. The next two out of these four defining qualities of the New World economy has to do with the American empire. And here the issue has to be faced squarely, although I understand and appreciate that that is difficult. The reality is that the American empire has peaked and is now declining. The data for this are overwhelming, as is the urgent tendency to deny it among people who find it frightening.
Let me explain what he's saying here when he says that the U.S. empire has peaked. We've gone as far as we're going to go. If you ever heard someone make that phrase that this kid peaked in high school, it means they went as far as they were going to go when they were in high school. And then after that, they just kind of dropped off. Just an example. But we've gone as far as we're going to go economically. Let's go on.
Which I understand. But I'm going to give you some of the signs to make sure we all understand it. I'll start with a small one and it'll get larger as we go. The tiny Central American country of Honduras recently decided to end its diplomatic relationships with the island of Taiwan and recognize as China the mainland. There are about 170, 80 countries in the world, only a dozen of which still recognize Taiwan as a separate sovereign entity.
Here we go.
A dozen, of which the United States is one. A dozen. Even Honduras. Think a minute what this suggests. Then there was the announcement a very few weeks ago made by a smiling Chinese foreign minister that a reconciliation of sorts had been achieved between two traditional enemies in the Middle East, Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other. Countries virtually at war, although by proxy often, wrapped up in the Sunni versus Shiite struggles within Islam. They were going to establish embassies in each other's capitals. They were going to lay down the weapons of war and try to work together for a broader peace in the war-riven Middle East. The United States was absent. It has been trying to build peace in the Middle East, at least that's what we've been told, and couldn't do it. The Chinese, an emerging new power in the world, did it.
Yep.
The importance and the symbolism are only deniable if it's too hard to face what's going on. And then there are the mistakes in the Ukraine war.
Here we go.
Let me count several of them for you. Mistake number one, that you can keep pushing the boundaries of NATO, an alliance of the West, traditionally opposed to the Soviet Union. You can push them more and more up against and even into Russia. Well, you can't.
That's
You're going
right.
to have pushback. It's not going to be what you thought it would be.
Right. I just want to remind people, remember, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in Germany, that was not supposed to happen. So NATO was not supposed to expand in that direction. So here we are.
Made a mistake. The second mistake was to imagine that this would be a war between Ukraine, aided by the collective West, and Russia alone. Let me remind you all, Russia is a country whose GDP is about $1.5 trillion. The United States and Western Europe, allied against Russia with Ukraine, have a combined GDP of about $32 trillion. 1.5 versus 32. Mistake. This is going to be easy. Russia will be crushed. Didn't happen. Isn't going to happen. Require way more involvement by the West than was ever understood. Now in the neighborhood of $100 to $150 billion and counting. Escalation after escalation without the promised result. Turns out Russia has very powerful friends helping Russia be a much more important foe. These are too many mistakes that come out of a mentality that doesn't want to face that the world has changed.
And I question if it is actually a mistake, if these were actually mistakes, or if the U.S. knew that this was a possibility and chose to do this anyway. You know, I wonder sometimes. I appreciate Professor Wolff speaking out about this because I know he's an economist and he's a professor, but he has been looking at this war with Russia and Ukraine from an economist lens. And I think maybe for the people who think that the U.S. government is doing the right thing right now in reference to this conflict, maybe if they would switch their focus for just a second and look at it through an economist lens, the way that Richard Wolff is looking at it, and then you can see, yikes, this is not working out too well. And billions of dollars just gone down the drain. Let's go on.
The vast majority of countries in the world, particularly those in the global South, are not particularly moved by the West's complaints about Russia. They're not taking sides in that conflict beyond an obligatory vote and an obligatory statement that peace would be better than war. The United States has been unable to marshal anything like a global consensus around its position. These are all signs of empire decline.
Yep.
If I had more time, I'd go into other signs.
I want to add a sign. Recently, it was President Macron. Now, I have many criticisms of him. I've been talking about him for a lot the past couple months, actually. But it was recently President Macron made that statement that maybe Europe should not follow the U.S. lead anymore. Maybe we should become like a third power on our own and not just be at the U.S. government's beck and call. That was the first time in my adult life I heard an ally of the United States make that statement. He also said that he would not follow the US lead and turn against China. So things are changing. Things are changing. I think that's another sign as well.
The challenges to the US dollar as global currency. The fact that Iran and Saudi Arabia will provide the energy needs of China in the indefinite future on an extraordinary scale, shifting the balance of fossil fuel power for sure. The fourth and the final question about the new economic order is different because it's not a fact about what's happening, it's a question. What happens next? And these are the questions that are going to be the questions that we try to answer, and how we try, and by we I mean the human race, how we try to answer these questions will shape the future we live in. Number one, will the declining American empire be replaced by a rising Chinese empire?
That could happen.
That's the question. Just like the question at the end of the Roman or Greek or Persian or Ottoman or British Empire was, what empire comes next?
Right. The greatest example to point to is the Roman Empire. And I want you to think about something he's mentioning here in reference to China. And I'm not one of these channels that fearmongers people about China, just letting you know that if you're new. But one of the things I want you to understand is that if you look at the top 10 banks in the world, not the United States, but the world, China has 4 in the top 5. That was not always the case. The first time you see a bank from the United States is number 6, and that's JP Morgan. The next time is Bank of America, and I believe they're number 10, if I remember correctly. So what does this tell you? Economically, the United States is losing its power. The United States, look, going away from the US dollar, the US government probably never thought that would happen. They probably never thought, there's no way that China and Brazil and India and South Africa, and they're all going to get together and form some type of collaboration. They probably thought there's no way that's going to happen. Happened. Because you see, the thing about empires is that eventually an empire falls. It's just a matter of when. And we saw that throughout history, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, like he just said. And I think we are at that point now where the US empire is starting to fall. If other countries don't need to depend on us for oil or the US dollar, they don't need us. If they don't need us, they don't have to listen to us. And that changes that dynamic of the US government policing the world. You see how that works? We got a little bit more here I want to play as well.
Or another question. Will the question be that we create instead of another empire? That the human race grows up and says, we don't need and we don't want sequential empires. What we need and want is a multinational, multipolar world. We really need a world in which lots of different countries, larger, smaller, individual grouped, work out a livable arrangement for all on this planet.
This is the same thing that Claire Daly was just hinting towards in the video that I just showed you, when she said these countries are moving away from the US dollar and they are creating a multinational or multipolar environment. Is that the way of the future? And if that's the way of the future, who's going to be in community with us? Because we've pissed off a lot of people. I'm just going to be honest. Who is going to be in community with us? Is Europe, our European allies, are they going to choose to be in community with us? Or are they going to do what President Macron suggested? Are they going to say, you know what, all of the European countries, we need to all band together and become a third power and say F you to the United States? What if they say, why do we need to continue to follow their orders anymore? Why don't we have our own power? Then what happens? What happens to the US government's hold on the world? What happens to all of those 800 military bases that the US government has around the world? What happens? Canada might go on their own. I saw someone said in the chat, they said Canada, Plant Power Radio. Unfortunately, Canada will stick with the US. Otherwise, you'll invade us. That's interesting. Even Mexico, there's talks about Mexico possibly joining BRICS.
With its limitations. That's a big question. The ecological movements are struggling from their end to answer it around nature and environment. But the political forces, the national forces, the economic realities are just as important in changing and shaping the questions and the answers. The economic growth of China in the last 40 years, that other part of neoliberal globalization that wasn't just about Western capitalists making a lot of money in the East, but what it would mean for the people of the East and by extension of the global South. We are now realizing the enormous economic power of the Chinese and the Indians.
Yep.
And indeed, all of those countries we label BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. A powerful new pole in world development.
I want to say something here about the global South, because I said this a long time ago, but I know I have new subscribers since then. Even some of these European countries that have social democracy, which is what Bernie Sanders talks about when he says he wants Americans to have the same like benefits as people in countries like Norway and Denmark, etc. Did you know that the reason why those countries are able to have some of the things that they do, where everybody can have unlimited vacation and everyone has healthcare, et cetera, and all that stuff, even if they are not exploiting the workers in their own country, there have been examples where they have exploited workers in the global South. That's usually where it will happen. If you look at a company like H&M, for example, they exploit workers in the global South. So if the global South, they're joining along with China, they're all together with BRICS, who is going to be exploited, continue to be exploited when they move away from the US dollar? How is that going to continue? A lot of people don't realize this. When you talk about those countries, I lived in Germany. I spent most of my childhood growing up in Germany. When you talk about those countries where they do have like democratic socialism or social democracy, whatever you want to call it, yeah, the people in those countries, the workers for the most part, yeah, they're not exploited for the most part. Like I said, they'll get the unlimited vacation. They'll get like 2-hour break, lunch break or whatever. Everybody has healthcare, those kinds of things. So when you go visit those countries, you're like, wow, everyone in this country is guaranteed housing. Wow, everyone in this country is guaranteed healthcare. And I agree with all those things. But I think it's important to mention that somewhere along the line, there are still people being exploited so that those countries can have what they have. And usually that exploitation will happen in places like the global South. This is something we have to really talk about more. There is a gentleman, Second Thought on YouTube. he talks about these kinds of issues with social democracy. Now, he is a socialist, but he does talk about this a lot. Definitely check him out. I should bring him on sometime, actually. I should reach out to him and see if I can bring him on. But people need to, this is something like, again, Bernie Sanders is not going to tell you this. Maybe Bernie does not know, like, to be honest. But if you talk to people who live in those countries, who live in the global South, they can explain this to you. And we're going to finish up here.
And the last question, and in the end, the most important one that we will be answering and that will shape the future we see in the new world economy. And that question is, will the kinds of friction and change and difficulty of this phase of capitalist development, this moving of its old centers and the creation of new centers, will it have the effect of agitating, mobilizing, and educating a global working class? I end with that because I think it's the most important thing to leave with you.
Very, very good points there from Professor Richard Wolff. I watch Economic Update once a week. Like, you guys should definitely watch that channel if you don't, because when we talk about having a working class, when we talk about having a class movement where people who are working class, hell, and honestly, these days, what's left of the middle class, can bond together and form some type of solidarity, we need to do so by talking about it as a global movement, not just a movement in the United States. And the reason why I'm saying that is because of what I just told you earlier, which is that you have exploitation of workers in countries like the global South. So you need to have that international solidarity. Now, there are many ways to go about doing that. Number one, we need to find some type of way to communicate with those people. There are multiple groups and organizations that do just that. But when we talk about having a class movement in this country, we need to make sure we're not just focusing on the United States. We need to make sure that we're adding our brothers and our sisters in the global South to this as well, because people in those countries are being exploited way more than people are in the United States, but it's all connected. So these are some of the things that we really do need to think about. But I got to tell you, when we talk about the U.S. empire, yes, it's crumbling. I want to show you some numbers. Let me go back to the screen, because I don't want to just tell you it's crumbling. I want to show you how it's been crumbling. Now, this is the history of recessions in the United States. Make it a little bit bigger. We're just going to go to a couple of key dates here. Most of you know what a recession is, so I'm not going to go into that detail. But let's start 1983. The Reading Railroad failed. 1873. The construction of the National Railway System created speculation that led to the collapse of the largest U.S. bank. 1857. Something I want you to look at here. Notice how they did not put that one in order. But anywho, notice how the gaps between the recessions are larger. Those gaps will close as we go on. And this is how you know we're heading for more economic issues. 1857, embezzlement at the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company's New York branch triggered a panic. 1797, the Panic of 1797 resulted from land speculation. The first Bank of the U.S. and the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, expanded the money supply, leading to boom and bust. Let's get to the 20th century. I covered this on a show. I did a whole show about this, the Panic of 1907. It was caused by speculators' losses that spread to trust companies. These firms acted like banks, but had lower reserves. Congress created the Federal Reserve System to prevent future collapse. So we go to 1907, and then we jump to 1929 through 1938, which is the Great Depression. Now you're seeing already over a 20-year gap in between those two periods for a recession. If you listen to economists now, they will tell you we have a recession like every 4 years. Let's go on. Boop-a-boop. 1945. The recession lasted 8 months from February to October. This was a result of the demobilization from World War II. 1949, 11th month recession. This was when unemployment peaked at 7.9%. It was caused by the Fed raising interest rates too quickly. 1953, again, notice the gap. Okay, see, notice now the gap is starting to get closer. 1953, it resulted from tightened monetary policy following the Korean War. 1957, in this recession, which took place from August 1957 to April 1958, GDP fell from 4.1%, then contracted to a low of 10% in quarter one, 1958. Unemployment didn't reach its peak. It says the Fed's contractionary monetary policy caused an economic slowdown. 1960, notice the years are getting closer. The gap is smaller. This one, it says that unemployment reached a peak of 7.1% in May 1961. They don't even give you a reason for this one. Just know that it happened. Okay. Moving on. It says that President JFK ended that 1960 recession with stimulus spending. So just keep that in mind. 1970. This one doesn't give you a reason either. It just says it was a relatively mild recession and it lasted for 11 months. Unemployment peaked at 6.1%. 1973 through 75. The OPEC oil embargo is blamed for quadrupling oil prices, but actions taken by President Richard Nixon also contributed to the recession. Let's go on. 1980. So now we're getting into the period where Ronald Reagan is coming about. Remember, Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, I believe. It says the Iranian oil embargo aggravated economic conditions by reducing U.S. oil supplies, which drove prices up. And this reminds me of Carter. Remember some of the criticism that people had about Jimmy Carter during that time, actually like the year or so before, was that they didn't like the way that he handled the Iran-Contra deal. So that's some of the criticism that I heard about Jimmy Carter's presidency for people who were alive and were adults during that time. I know, Midnight Karma, Reagan. I know. 1990. I remember this one very well. It was caused by the 1989 savings and loans crisis, higher interest rates, and Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. So my dad was in Desert Storm, so he was there for that. So I remember this. Let's move on. 21st century. This is when everything, the ball just drops. 2001. This recession lasted 8 months. The Y2K scare had partially created the boom in 2000. Raise your hand if you remember Y2K. You guys remember that? Companies bought billions of dollars worth of new software because they were afraid the old systems weren't designed to transition from the 1900s to the 2000s. Many dot-com businesses were significantly overvalued and failed. For younger people in the chat, it was believed during this time, in the year 1990, there was this belief that the world was going to end when the year 2000, when we went into the year 2000, because the computer systems only went up to 1999. I'm not kidding for the younger people in the chat. Like, people had like doomsday bunkers created and everything for this because people thought that that was going to be the end of the world. The 9/11 attack worsened the recession. That's important to know as well. And this one, I think most of us remember this one. Who can forget 08, 09, the subprime mortgage crisis? And I'll be honest with you, financially, economically, things have been tough since. At least for me, it was. It was tough since 08. This was during a time when I had to have 2 jobs. I had a college degree, I had to work 2 jobs. People didn't want to hire you for a professional job during that time just because they were not available. It was very hard, very, very hard. Okay. And now 2020 recession. Okay, so it said March of 2020, the Federal Reserve lowered the Fed funds rate to basically 0%. Congress issued billions of dollars in aid. The U.S. economy contracted a record 31.2% in the second quarter after falling 5.1% in the previous quarter. In April 2020, the U.S. economy lost an astonishing 20.5 million jobs. So we all know, we know what happened in 2020. But notice how they don't even mention that. They don't even mention the pandemic when we talk about the 2020 recession, which is really interesting. But that being said, Professor Wolf will tell you recessions happen approximately about every 4 years now. It's crazy. But yes, the U.S. empire is falling.